The noise was the first thing that hit me. A deep, thumping bass that vibrated right through the soles of my sensible shoes. I was standing in the corner of a cavernous brick warehouse that had been converted into some kind of party space, holding a tiny glass of sparkling wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. This was the launch party for my son Leo's big tech startup. I felt like a tourist in my own life. I was just trying to look busy near the bar when I heard her voice cut through the music. It was Chloe, my son's girlfriend and business partner, talking to a man in a ridiculously tight suit. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, and gestured with her glass in my direction. "Oh, that's Leo's mom," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "She spent her life tracking packages in a warehouse or something. We had to liquidate her entire folksy retirement fund to secure our seed round. She thinks it's an investment, which is adorable." The man chuckled. The expensive glass in my hand suddenly felt as heavy as a cinder block. Every noisy, chaotic part of the room faded into a dull roar, and those words just hung there in the air, glittering and cruel. Liquidate, folksy, adorable. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it clicked into place with a cold, hard snap. My son had forgotten that before I was his mother, I was one of the best logistics managers in the Midwest, and I was about to audit his entire life. To understand the real cost of that night, we need to go back 2 months, to the day they first pitched their brilliant idea at my kitchen table. That pitch didn't happen in some slick downtown boardroom. It happened at my kitchen table. It's not a fancy table. It's solid oak, bought at a garage sale 30 years ago. It's the same table where Leo did his first-grade homework, where I helped him build a model of the solar system out of styrofoam balls, and where I paid our bills every Sunday night for my entire adult life. It was a place of truth, of hard numbers and honest work. I thought that meant something. They arrived that Saturday morning buzzing with an energy that felt alien in my quiet house. Leo was dressed in a crisp, new button-down, and Chloe wore a sleek black dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I had a pot of coffee brewing, the good Maxwell House kind, but Chloe wrinkled her nose slightly and pulled 2 cans of some fancy cold brew from her oversized purse. "You have to try this, Mags," she said, her voice bright and a little too loud. "It's infused with nitrogen. It optimizes cognitive function." I just smiled and poured my regular coffee into my favorite chipped ceramic mug. They sat down, pushing aside my little basket of mail, and Leo opened a laptop that was so thin it looked like it could snap in two. The screen glowed to life, filled with charts and graphs in aggressive, bright colors. "Mom," Leo started, his eyes shining with a fervor I hadn't seen since he was a kid begging for a new bike. "We are on the verge of something huge, revolutionary." Chloe took over, her words coming out in a rapid-fire burst of jargon that felt designed to overwhelm. "We're not just creating an app, Mags. We're architecting a B2C ecosystem to monetize hyperlocal community engagement. SyncLife is a paradigm shift in social resourcing." I nodded slowly, trying to find a single, solid thing to hold onto in that flood of words. My gaze drifted to the corner of my kitchen, where my old Monroe adding machine sat on its own small, sturdy desk. It's a beast, a heavy beige machine with big, chunky buttons that make a satisfying thunk when you press them. I used it for 25 years to balance the books for the entire Midwest shipping depot. It never lied. The numbers went in, you pulled the lever, and the truth came out on a neat little slip of paper. It dealt in reality, in weight, and distance, and dollars and cents. Chloe followed my gaze and let out a little laugh. "Oh my God, what is that? A museum piece?" Leo shot her a quick look, but the damage was done. "It's just Mom's old calculator," he said, turning back to me. "Mom, forget that stuff. This is the future." He clicked a button, and a new chart appeared. It was a steep, swooping line that shot straight up into the stratosphere. "These are our 5-year growth projections," he said, his voice full of awe. I looked at the line. It didn't account for fuel costs, or union contracts, or a freak snowstorm shutting down the I-80 for 3 days. It was just a line, drawn on a screen, full of hope and nothing else. "That's optimistic, honey," I said, my voice softer than I intended. That was when Leo's face fell. The eager salesman disappeared, and my son appeared in his place, his expression wounded. "You don't get it," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "You think I want to end up like Dad, stuck in a cubicle for 40 years, waiting for a pension that barely covers the bills? I want to build something real. Don't you want that for me?" And there it was. The hook. The one he knew I could never resist. It wasn't about B2C ecosystems or hyperlocal engagement anymore. It was about my son's happiness. It was about all the sacrifices, all the overtime shifts I'd worked so he could have more than I did. It was about him looking at me with that desperate hope in his eyes, asking me to believe in him. Chloe saw her opening and slid a glossy folder across the table. "This is just the paperwork, Mags," she said, her voice now soft and reassuring. "It's a simple transfer of assets from your 401k into the company's seed fund. You'll be our primary investor, a founding partner. A founding partner. Me, who still balanced her checkbook by hand every month." I opened the folder. It was filled with pages of dense, legal text that made my eyes swim. I saw my name, my account numbers, and a final, staggering figure that represented my entire life's work. Every dollar I had ever saved. My security, my independence, everything was on those pages. Leo reached across the table and placed his hand on mine. His skin was warm. "This is it, Mom," he whispered. "This is for us, for our family's future. Please, trust me." I looked from his earnest, pleading face to the cold, impersonal document. I could feel the silent judgment of my old Monroe adding machine from across the room. It knew this was a bad calculation. It knew there were no hard numbers to back this up. It was all hope and risk. But I wasn't looking at a balance sheet anymore. I was looking at my son. I picked up the pen Chloe offered. It was light and cheap, and it felt flimsy in my fingers. I took a deep breath, the scent of Chloe's perfume mixing with the stale coffee, and I signed my name on the line. The scratch of the ink on the paper was the only sound in the room. The moment it was done, the tension vanished. Chloe's bright professional smile snapped back into place. They packed up their laptop with an efficiency that was almost startling. "We've got to run," Leo said, already heading for the door. "Big meeting with a venture capital firm this afternoon. This is going to give us so much leverage." He gave me a quick, distracted hug at the door, and then they were gone. I stood in my silent kitchen, the empty cold brew cans still sitting on the table next to the signed copies of the documents. The only thing they had left behind was the ghost of their ambition and a deep, cold knot of dread settling in my stomach. I walked over to my old adding machine and ran my fingers over the cool, solid keys. They didn't feel like the future. They felt like the truth. And I had a terrible feeling I had just signed it away. Running my fingers over those cool, heavy keys, I remembered a time when their sound wasn't one of nostalgia, but of battle. The rhythmic thunk-clack of my Monroe adding machine was the soundtrack to my life for 30 years, a steady beat beneath the chaos of managing a logistics depot that was the pulsing heart of the entire state. It was a language of numbers, of weight and time and distance. A language of getting things done. My son, Leo, used to think it was the most boring job in the world, until the blizzard of '98, the year he turned 16. It wasn't just a snowstorm. It was a full-blown Arctic siege, a state of emergency, the kind of blizzard that gets a name on the national news. I was at the depot, already 12 hours into my shift, navigating a nightmare of jackknifed semis on the I-80 and stranded drivers running low on diesel. The office air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and wet wool. Outside the plate glass windows, the world had disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. Then the phone rang. It was Leo. "It's over, Mom," he sobbed, his voice cracking with that unique brand of teenage despair that feels like the end of the world. "The airport's closed. All the flights are canceled. It's over." It was the National Youth Robotics Competition in Denver. For a year, our garage had been his laboratory. He had spent hundreds of hours hunched over a circuit board, soldering wires and writing code, building a robotic arm that could assemble a puzzle with terrifying precision. It was his masterpiece. His ticket to a scholarship, he hoped. And it was currently sitting in a custom-built crate at the end of our driveway, going nowhere. My heart ached for him. Every parent knows that feeling, the desperate helplessness of watching your child's dream get crushed by something completely out of their control. But then, another part of my brain took over. The part that had been trained for 30 years to see a crisis not as a wall, but as a puzzle. a logistics problem. "Stop crying and listen to me," I said, my voice shifting from mom to manager. "Is the crate sealed?" "Yes, but what does it—" "Go pack a bag with enough clothes for 3 days, and put on your warmest boots." I hung up before he could argue. The office was chaos, phones ringing, the dispatch radio crackling with panicked voices. But in my mind, it all went quiet. I strode over to the massive wall-sized map of the United States, its surface crisscrossed with shipping routes. The airports were red X's, the interstates were clogged arteries, but the smaller highways, the veins and capillaries of the country, they were still flowing, if you knew which ones to take. I got on the horn to my drivers. "Big Earl, you out there?" "Where are you?" The radio crackled back. "Stuck at the Flying J just west of Des Moines, Mags. Ain't movin' till this blows over." "You have a reefer unit, right?" I asked, referring to his refrigerated trailer. "Yeah, full of frozen pork." "Well, your pork is about to get a roommate," I said. My fingers flew across the keypad of my Monroe, calculating fuel, mileage, and overtime. Thunk, thunk, clack. The numbers were ugly, but they were possible. For the next 4 hours, that office was my command center. I orchestrated a ballet of 18-wheelers across 3 states. First I called Gus, a local driver with a smaller truck, who owed me a favor. He navigated the treacherous back roads to my house, loaded Leo and his precious crate, and ferried them 60 miles south to a truck stop just outside the storm's main fury. Then, I convinced Big Earl to deadhead his empty trailer back 20 miles, a cardinal sin in the trucking world, to meet them. He loaded Leo's crate amongst the frozen pork, with Leo himself riding shotgun, wide-eyed and terrified. Earl took them as far as Kearney, Nebraska, where the storm finally broke. There, as arranged by a series of crackling calls over the CB radio, they met Maria, another of my drivers, who was hauling produce from California to Chicago. I had her reroute, pick up the boy and his robot, and make the final 9-hour push to Denver. Through it all, I sat at my desk, the maps spread out before me like a battlefield. I was a general, moving my troops, rerouting supply lines, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the relentless, reassuring rhythm of my adding machine. Thunk-clack, thunk-clack. It was the sound of a promise being kept. The next afternoon, the phone rang again. It was Leo, his voice breathless and filled with a kind of holy disbelief. "Mom, I'm here, I'm in Denver. The robot is fine. How did you even do that?" I looked out my office window. The snow had stopped. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The plows were finally clearing the interstate. "I just moved some packages around, honey," I told him. "Now go win." He did. He took home second place, and the university scouts who were there took notice. It changed his life. That memory faded, and I was back in my silent kitchen, my hand resting on the cold, dormant keys of the Monroe. I had moved heaven and earth for him. I had bent the very infrastructure of the country to his will because his dream was my dream. I had been his problem solver, his secret weapon, his manager, and now, in his eyes, I was just a folksy, adorable old woman whose life's work was nothing more than a seed fund for his brilliant, important future. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than any snowstorm. In the past, it had been a comfortable silence, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Now, it felt like an absence, an emptiness, where my son used to be. That emptiness was the first thing the new regime sought to fill. It started with my pantry. Chloe arrived one Tuesday afternoon unannounced, her arms full of clear plastic bins and a label maker. She called it a surprise home optimization. I called it an invasion. For 40 years, my pantry has been my system. I know every can, every bag of flour, every box of pasta by touch and by its place on the shelf. It's a map of my life, of meals cooked and holidays celebrated. To her, it was just clutter. "We have to streamline your workflow, Mags," she chirped, pulling out bags of sugar my mother had taught me to store in old coffee cans. She replaced them with sterile, airtight containers, labeling each one in a crisp sans serif font. "See? Now you can visually track your inventory. It's all about efficiency." I just stood there, leaning against the counter, watching her dismantle my history and call it progress. She held up my grandmother's old tin recipe box, the one with the faded painted roses on the lid. "And this is just creating so much visual noise," she said. I can scan all these into a digital file for you. We can put it in the cloud. I took the box from her hand, my fingers tracing the worn-out flowers. I think I'll keep the noise, I said, placing it back on the shelf. The small, firm click of the tin lid was the only protest I made that day. Then came the Sundays. For as long as I can remember, Leo and I had a standing date. Sunday dinner, 6 p.m., at a little diner called the Silver Grill. It was our time. But after the investment, the texts started. The first one was almost apologetic. "So slammed with investor meetings, Mom. Can we rain check?" I understood. I went to the diner alone, read a book, and told our usual waitress, Barb, that Leo was busy building his future. A week later, another text. "Crushing code before our beta launch. Can't make it." This time, it stung. The following Sunday, I didn't even get a text. I just knew. I stopped making the big pot roast I used to cook on the weekends. There was no point in cooking, for one. My kitchen table, the place where he had pitched his dream, was now just a place I put my mail. The final straw, the one that broke something deep inside me, came a month later. They arrived with a gift. It was a tablet, but a strange one, with huge, cartoonish icons and only 3 buttons. "We got you a simplified computer," Leo announced, beaming as if he'd just solved world hunger. Chloe chimed in, speaking to me slowly and loudly, as if I were hard of hearing. "See, Mags? This one is designed for seniors. No confusing menus, just email, photos, and video chat. You can't mess it up." I looked at the device. They saw me as a woman who needed technology dumbed down, who couldn't be trusted with a normal computer. Me, the woman who had managed a mainframe system that tracked 10,000 shipments a day across a continent. The woman who had taught herself how to code in Fortran in the 70s because she wanted a raise. They had no memory of that person. They had erased her. I just smiled a thin, tight smile. "Thank you," I said. "It's very thoughtful." That night, long after they were gone, I sat in the glow of my old desktop computer, the one they thought was too confusing for me. My fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, navigating the complex budget spreadsheets I still used to manage my finances. On one screen, I had my meticulously balanced checkbook. On the other, I pulled up the stock performance of every major tech company from the last 20 years. I wasn't a senior who couldn't be messed up. I was a woman who knew that numbers, real numbers, never lied. The next time they came for dinner, I decided to test a theory. I mentioned a news story I'd read about a tech startup that had failed because of poor cash flow management. "You know," I said casually, "when I was at the depot, the first thing we learned was that you can have all the orders in the world, but if you can't manage your payables, you're sunk." Chloe patted my hand, a gesture of pure, unadulterated condescension. "That's so sweet, Mags," she said, not even looking up from her phone. "But this is a disruptive tech space. It's a whole different world. It's not about moving boxes." Leo just nodded, scrolling through his own phone. "She's right, Mom. It's a different game now." He didn't even see it. He didn't see that everything is about moving boxes. Whether it's a truck full of pork or a packet of data, it all has to get from point A to point B. It all costs something. It all has to be tracked. They saw my experience as a relic, a museum piece like my old adding machine. They thought my world was small and outdated. They had no idea how big it really was, or how clearly I was starting to see theirs. That clarity changed everything. The sadness that had been sitting on my chest like a lead blanket for weeks didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It became something hard, and sharp, and useful. I stopped looking back at the past, at the boy who loved his robotics project. I started looking at the present, at the men he and his partner had become. As a founding partner, they sent me quarterly expense reports. It was a courtesy, a way to make me feel included in the game. For the first couple of quarters, I just glanced at the bottom line number, my heart swelling with a foolish, unearned pride. But on that cool Tuesday morning in October, I didn't just glance. I brewed a pot of strong, black coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and printed out the latest report. I decided to read it. Not as a mother, but as a manager. The paper felt thin and cheap in my hands. The columns were neatly aligned: travel and entertainment, server costs, marketing, payroll. The numbers were large, but not impossible. It all looked professional enough if you didn't look too closely. But my entire career was about looking closely. It was about spotting the one container that was 5 pounds overweight, the one signature that didn't match the manifest, the one truck that was an hour behind schedule. It was about finding the anomaly, and there it was. On page 3, under Operational Expenditures, a recurring monthly payment of $25,000 to a vendor called Ethelred Digital Solutions. The name snagged in my brain. It was too fancy, too medieval. In my experience, companies that did real work had simple names, boring names, like Mid-State Data Processing or Reliable IT. Ethelred sounded like something a kid would name a dragon in a video game. My eyes narrowed. I scanned the invoice number. It was INV 8001. I flipped back a page. The other invoices were all in the 700 series. It was a rookie mistake. A clumsy, arrogant error. They hadn't even bothered to make their fake numbers look real. A cold, electric thrill shot through me. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in years. It was the thrill of the hunt. My gaze darted to the vendor address listed next to the name. It wasn't a street address. It was a P.O. box. In Wilmington, Delaware. My internal monologue started, quiet and methodical, like a checklist. Delaware. The easiest state in the country to set up an anonymous shell corporation. No physical office, just a mailbox. A $25,000 monthly payment for unspecified solutions to a P.O. box. It was all circumstantial, of course. But 30 years in logistics teaches you that there are no coincidences, just patterns you haven't fully identified yet. This was the beginning of a pattern. I pushed the flimsy printout away. The numbers on it were lies, illusions on a screen made real by my signature. I needed to find the truth, and for that, I needed a better machine. I stood up and walked over to the small desk in the corner of my kitchen. My old Monroe sat there, silent beneath its yellowed plastic dust cover. I pulled the cover off with a soft whoosh, the faint smell of motor oil and old paper rising to meet me. I plugged the heavy cord into the wall socket. The machine hummed to life, a low, guttural whir that was the most comforting sound I had heard in months. It was the sound of certainty. I didn't go back to the kitchen table. That was a mother's space, a place of memory and emotion. I sat down at the small desk, the manager's desk. From a drawer, I took out a fresh green ledger book, the kind with the neat columns and the crisp numbered lines. I took out a single wooden pencil and sharpened it to a fine, dangerous point. My heart wasn't pounding with anger. It was beating with a slow, steady rhythm, the rhythm of a job to be done. I was no longer a grieving mother, a forgotten relic, an adorable folksy investor. I was Margaret Caldwell, logistics manager, retired, and my son's company had a serious discrepancy in its books. I pulled the report back over, smoothed it out, and looked at the first number. My fingers found the keys on the Monroe, the big, solid keys that fit my hands perfectly. Thunk, clack, thunk, thunk, clack. The sound echoed in the quiet house, a sound they had dismissed as obsolete. They were about to learn that some old systems are the ones that last the longest. It was time for a silent audit. That silent audit became my entire world. My quiet little house, which had felt so empty, transformed into a command center. The kitchen table was my war room. The hum of my old desktop computer was my engine. And the steady, rhythmic thunk-clack of my Monroe adding machine was my heartbeat. For the first time in a long time, I had a mission. I wasn't a mother mourning a son. I was a manager tracking a missing shipment, my life's savings. The first step in any audit is to verify your sources. The expense reports they gave me were fantasy. I needed facts. My investigation didn't start with a Google search. It started with a Rolodex. It's a clunky, old-fashioned thing, filled with cards yellowed by time, but the names and numbers on them were connections I had built over 30 years. They were real. I flipped through the worn cards until I found the one I was looking for. Frank Rizzo, former Teamsters union rep, retired to a condo in Sarasota. I poured a cup of coffee and dialed his number. "Frank, it's Mags Caldwell," I said, keeping my voice light. "Long time. Listen, I have a strange question for you. You still know anyone in corporate registration? Specifically, in Delaware." There was a pause, then Frank's gravelly laugh. "Mags, you fall into a pile of manure. You come out smelling like a rose and holding a spreadsheet to calculate the tonnage. What were you hunting?" "Just a loose end," I said. "A vendor I can't get a read on." He called me back an hour later. Ethelred Digital Solutions, he grunted. Registered 6 months ago. Fresh out of the box. Single officer listed on the paperwork. A woman named Chloe Vance. I felt a cold, clean wave of certainty wash over me. It wasn't anger. It was confirmation. The first piece of the puzzle locking into place. I opened my green ledger book, and under the heading, Fraudulent Vendors, I wrote her name. The pencil tip was sharp, and the letters were neat and final. The next step was to follow the money. They had been stupid enough to give me online portal access to the company's financials to maintain the illusion of transparency. They probably assumed I'd never look past the summary page. They assumed wrong. I spent a whole night digging, clicking through submenus and document archives until I found what I was looking for, scanned copies of the actual bank statements. My printer hummed and whirred into the wee hours of the morning, spitting out page after page of their life. My life. It was all there in black and white. The regular, lump sum payments to Ethelred, just as the reports had said, but there were other things too. Thousands of dollars to designer stores in New York, a $10,000 charge at a beach resort in Miami, a recurring monthly lease payment for a Porsche. This is where their world and mine collided. My old-school methods met their new-school arrogance. I opened another browser window and navigated to Chloe's public Instagram page. It was a glossy, curated fantasy of a life I couldn't imagine. And it was the most detailed evidence locker I could have asked for. I began to cross-reference. A $5,000 charge to Saks Fifth Avenue on the bank statement? I scrolled and found it. A photo of Chloe, posted on the exact same date, posing in front of a mirror in a new coat, a shopping bag with the store's logo sitting at her feet. Caption, celebrating a big win for Sync Life, number girl boss. The $10,000 charge from the Setai Miami Beach. I found that too, a picture of her and Leo clinking champagne glasses by an infinity pool. Caption, Miami work trip. So important to recharge the batteries. Number startup life. The Porsche lease? A video of Leo, my son, laughing as he revved the engine, the sun glinting off the hood. He had told me it was a company car to impress investors. The bank statement told me it was a personal lease, paid for with my retirement money. They weren't just thieves. They were performers. They were putting on a show, and my life savings was funding the production. They documented their own crimes, time-stamped and geotagged for the whole world to see. It was the sloppiest fraud I had ever seen. Hubris. That's the one shipping expense you can never account for. The one that will sink a company every single time. The final discovery was the one that truly broke me. Buried deep in the transaction history was a single, massive wire transfer. $200,000. It wasn't to a vendor or a hotel. It was to a separate, internal account. I clicked on the details, my heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat. It was a joint savings account. The names listed as owners were Leo Caldwell and Chloe Vance. My son's name, my son and his girlfriend. The memo line for the transfer, typed by Leo himself, contained 3 words, Phase 2 funding. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark kitchen. They weren't just bleeding the company dry for a lavish lifestyle. They were systematically draining its capital into a personal escape fund. This was the plan. This had always been the plan. I gathered the printouts, the bank statements, the glossy Instagram photos, the corporate registration from Delaware. I laid them all out on my kitchen table, a mosaic of their betrayal. I sat down at my desk, switched on the Monroe and began to add it all up. The car lease, the trips, the shopping sprees, the stolen Phase 2 funding, thunk-clack, thunk-clack. Each press of a key was a nail in a coffin I didn't even know I was building. The numbers grew, climbing higher and higher on the little slip of paper, telling a story far more honest than any of their flashy presentations. They had liquidated my future. I was about to calculate the cost of theirs. The final thunk-clack of the Monroe echoed in the silent kitchen, and I pulled the long slip of paper from the machine. The final number was there, a figure of such profound betrayal that it almost didn't seem real. I wrote it neatly on the last page of my green ledger book, circled it twice, and closed the cover with a soft, definitive thud. The audit was complete. All the shipments were tracked, all the expenses accounted for. The full cost of my son's ambition was now a simple, undeniable fact. I didn't do anything at first. I just waited. For 3 days I went about my life. I weeded the marigolds in my garden. I read a novel I'd checked out from the library. I made myself soup for dinner. On the surface, everything was the same. But underneath, a profound shift had occurred. I was no longer a victim adrift in a sea of confusion. I was a hunter, sitting patiently in a blind, waiting for my prey to make its final, predictable move. My analysis of their spending had shown me they were living on borrowed time. They had burned through the liquid assets, the money they could easily skim from the expense accounts at an alarming rate. The Porsches and the five-star hotels weren't cheap. I knew, with the certainty of a career logistician, that they would soon need access to the principal, the core of my investment, the big shipment, and to move that, they would need me. On Thursday afternoon, the phone rang. The caller ID flashed with a picture of Leo from 5 years ago, smiling on a fishing trip. For a moment, my heart ached with the memory of the boy in that photo. I took one slow, steadying breath, letting the memory go, and answered with a calm, simple, "Hello." "Mom, hi, I have the most amazing news." His voice was a little too loud, a little too bright. It was the same voice he used as a kid when he was trying to convince me he hadn't been the one to break the living room lamp. I said nothing. I just listened. "So, you know that institutional investor I told you about? Well, they're in. They're all in. It's a game changer, Mom. We're going to the next level." My mind was working quietly, deconstructing his words. Institutional investor. A lie. There is no investor. He's setting the stage for a large transaction. "That's wonderful, honey," I said, my voice as smooth and even as a calm lake. "Yeah, it's incredible. But you know, lawyers," he laughed, a short, nervous bark of a sound. "They have all this red tape. To finalize the deal, we need to consolidate all the company's seed assets into a new fund. It's just a procedural thing. Consolidate assets. He means he needs to move the core investment capital." Chloe must be standing next to him, holding up a script. "I see," I said. He finally got to it, his voice dropping into a more serious, confidential tone. "So, the lawyers have drawn up a power of attorney form. It's just a formality, really. It just gives Chloe the authority to manage the transfer of the initial capital into the new holding account. It's the last piece of the puzzle. We need to get it signed by tomorrow, or the whole deal could fall through. A power of attorney. The legal instrument that would hand them the keys to the entire kingdom, the final, irreversible step in their plan to erase me completely. It was the most audacious, insulting request I could possibly imagine, and I agreed to it. "All right, Leo," I said, and I could hear the sharp, surprised intake of his breath on the other end of the line. He had been expecting a fight, questions, resistance. I gave him none. "That's fine. What do I need to do?" The relief in his voice was so thick I could almost taste it. "Oh, great. That's great, Mom. Can you meet us at the lawyer's office tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock? It's the firm of Sterling, Blackwood, and Finch, downtown in the Fifth Third Center. A fancy, expensive law firm. Of course, the stage had to be perfect for the final act of their performance. "I'll be there," I said. 10 o'clock. "Thanks, Mom, you're the best. This is it. We're finally going to make it. Goodbye, Leo," I said, and hung up the phone. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of a clock that has been wound, a spring that has been coiled. It was the silence before the strike. I walked over to my desk. I took out the green ledger. I gathered the printouts of the bank statements, the damning Instagram photos, the Delaware corporate registration with Chloe's name on it. I slid each one into a clear plastic sleeve. I organized them chronologically in a simple 3-ring binder. It wasn't a fancy report. It was just the facts. It was just the truth. That evening, I laid out my clothes for the next day. Not a suit. I didn't own one. I chose a simple gray dress I'd had for years, the one I always wore to church on Easter. It was dignified. It was respectable. It was the last thing they would expect. I placed the binder in my large, practical purse right next to my wallet. It felt heavy. It felt solid. My son had called me his founding partner. He had no idea what that really meant. A partner's job isn't just to provide the capital. A partner's job is to manage the risk. And my son, and the woman he loved, had become the biggest risk in the entire portfolio. The trap was set. All I had to do now was walk into it. The next morning, I drove downtown. The law firm of Sterling, Blackwood, and Finch was on the 42nd floor of a glass and steel tower that scraped the sky. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and hushed whispers, a world away from my little house with its creaky floors and the smell of coffee. I felt out of place, but for the first time in a long time, I did not feel small. I took the elevator up, the city shrinking below me, and I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't a mother coming to see her son. I was a manager coming to a final meeting to liquidate a toxic asset. A receptionist led me into a corner conference room. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic sweep of the entire county. A long, dark, polished table reflected the sky like a black mirror. Leo and Chloe were already there, sitting on one side, a young man in a perfectly tailored suit sitting with them. He was their lawyer. Leo wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared down at his hands, fiddling with a pen. Chloe, however, was radiant. She was wearing a sharp white blazer, looking every bit the conquering CEO. She stood up and gave me an air kiss that smelled of expensive perfume and victory. "Mags, you made it," she chirped. "Isn't this incredible? Can you believe we're finally here?" "Hello, Chloe." "Leo," I said, my voice even. The young lawyer stood and shook my hand. His grip was firm, his smile was slick. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm Jonathan Finch. It's a pleasure. We're all very excited about today." I just nodded and took a seat opposite them. The leather chair was cool against my back. For a few moments, the only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. The slow burn was over. The silence in this room was the pause before the flash. "Well," Mr. Finch said, rubbing his hands together. "Let's get to it. A great day for the family, and for Sync Life." He slid a thick, creamy document across the polished surface of the table. It stopped perfectly in front of me. "The power of attorney. The instrument of my final erasure. If you'll just sign on the last page, we can begin the asset transfer." Chloe leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "This is it, Mags. The moment we take over the world." I looked down at the document. I saw the neat, black and white lines of text, the legal jargon designed to be intimidating, the empty space waiting for my signature. I thought of my green ledger, with its hand-drawn lines and penciled-in numbers. They had their story. I had mine. I didn't pick up the pen. Instead, I reached into my large, practical purse and took out my binder. It was just a simple 1-inch 3-ring binder from the corner drugstore. I placed it on the table. It made a soft but solid thud in the silent room, a sound of absolute finality. I looked directly at their lawyer, Mr. Finch. I did not look at my son. "Before I sign anything," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the stillness, "you, as their counsel, should review this." I gave the binder a gentle push. It slid across the frictionless surface and stopped in front of him. Confusion flickered across his face. He looked at Leo and Chloe, who just shrugged. Chloe rolled her eyes, a gesture of pure annoyance. With a sigh, the lawyer opened the binder. I watched his face. I saw the professional curiosity in his eyes as he looked at the first page, the cover sheet I had typed up, Sync Life, Incorporated Internal Audit and Discrepancy Report. I saw the flicker of interest as he turned to the second page, the State of Delaware corporate filing for Ethelred Digital Solutions, with Chloe's name listed as the sole officer. Then he turned the page again. His composure vanished. His jaw went slack. On the page was a printout of Chloe's Instagram post from Miami, the champagne glasses, the infinity pool. Next to it was the corresponding bank statement, with the $10,000 charge from the Satai Hotel circled in red ink. I had done that for every single fraudulent transaction. The Porsche, the shopping sprees, the flights. Page after page, a glossy, full-color catalog of their crimes, laid out next to the cold, hard numbers of their theft. His face went pale. He swallowed hard and quickly flipped through the rest of the pages, his eyes widening in horror. He stopped at the final page, the wire transfer confirmation for $200,000 to their personal savings account. He closed the binder with a sharp, definitive snap. "What is this?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill. "What are you trying to pull, you crazy old woman?" The lawyer held up a hand to silence her, but he was looking at me. His slick, professional mask was gone. He looked like a young man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. I stood up slowly, my chair making no sound on the thick carpet. I still didn't look at Chloe. I looked at him. "That," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level, is a complete logistical analysis of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. I have documented the flow of every dollar from my initial investment to their personal accounts. I paused, letting the words hang in the sterile air. A full, unredacted copy was sent by certified mail to the State Attorney General's office this morning. Another is currently on its way to the IRS. Then and only then did I turn and look at my son. He was as white as a sheet, his mouth hanging open, his eyes filled with a dawning, sickening understanding. He looked like a little boy again, lost and terrified. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel pity. I just felt done. The final entry on the balance sheet. I was the risk, I said to him, my voice not much more than a whisper. I was the risk you forgot to manage. And then I turned, and I walked out of that silent, glass-walled room, leaving the wreckage of their brilliant future scattered across that beautiful, polished table. I didn't run. I walked, my footsteps steady on the cool marble floor of the hallway. As the heavy conference room door swung shut behind me with a soft, expensive sigh, I thought I heard the beginning of a shout, a shrill, sharp sound, but it was cut off, muffled by the thick, soundproofed wood. I didn't need to be in the room to know what was happening. I had spent my entire life studying systems, and I knew exactly what a system overload looked like. I was told later, by a very apologetic, very frightened Mr. Finch, what happened in those first few moments. The second the door closed, Chloe apparently exploded. Her carefully constructed facade of the calm, conquering CEO shattered into a million pieces. She started screaming, calling me a vindictive, crazy old woman, a thief who was trying to steal their dream. She told Finch to sue me, to ruin me, to get on the phone and destroy my life. Leo, on the other hand, did nothing. He just sat there, frozen, staring at the simple 3-ring binder in the middle of that vast, empty table. He looked, the lawyer said, like a man who had just watched a magic trick in reverse, seeing the illusion of his own life ripped away to reveal the cheap, tawdry mechanics underneath. He didn't speak, he didn't move. He just stared at the proof of his own downfall. Mr. Finch, to his credit, understood the gravity of the situation instantly. He had been hired to facilitate a transfer of assets, and he had just been made an accessory to a federal crime. His first command, barked with the panic of a man watching his career circle the drain, was, "Shut up, both of you, right now. Do not say another word." Attorney-client privilege is in effect as of this second. But it was already too late. In their arrogance, they had patched in a conference call with a potential venture capital firm, a real one this time, hoping to use my final signature as leverage. Those investors, sitting in their own sleek boardroom in Silicon Valley, had heard everything. The quiet, damning presentation of my audit, Chloe's shrieking, panicked denial, and then a very loud, very final click as they disconnected the call. The institutional funding, the very excuse for this meeting, had evaporated before I even reached the elevator. That was just the first domino to fall. My report to the Attorney General wasn't a threat. It was a notification. It was a shipping manifest, informing the authorities that a crime was already in progress. It triggered a cascade of legal actions that I had already set in motion with the help of a quiet, methodical lawyer of my own. By the time I was stepping out of the elevator into the cold marble lobby, an emergency injunction was being filed. By the time I was walking out of the building's revolving doors into the bright midday sun, all of SyncLife's corporate accounts were frozen. By the time I had paid for my parking and was pulling out onto the street, Leo and Chloe's personal accounts, including their secret Phase 2 funding, were frozen too. Their access to my money, to any money, was gone. The entire system had been shut down. I didn't cause the crash. I just filed the flight plan that showed they were heading straight for a mountain. They thought business was about disruption, about breaking things. They forgot that when you break things, you have to pay for them. They thought they were building a revolutionary new company, but all they had built was a house of cards, and I had just turned on the fan. I didn't go home. I drove across town, to the old neighborhood, and I went to the Silver Grill. I slid into the worn vinyl of the booth where Leo and I used to have our Sunday dinners. Barb, the waitress, came over with a coffee pot. "Just one today, Mags?" she asked, her eyes kind. "Just one, Barb," I said. She filled my mug, the dark, steaming coffee a welcome sight. I wrapped my hands around its warmth. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I felt balanced. The ledger was clear. The accounts were settled. The chaos I had unleashed in that 40th floor office was just a natural consequence. It was the system writing itself. They had lived in a world of illusion, of flashy presentations and filtered photos, a world of things that looked good on a screen but had no weight, no substance. I had spent my life in the real world, a world of invoices and manifests and trucks full of real things, moving across real miles, a world where the numbers had to add up or the whole system would fall apart. Their system had just fallen apart. Mine, the one I had built my life on, the one of quiet work and honest accounting, was still standing. And in the quiet of that old diner, it felt stronger than ever. That coffee at the Silver Grill was the best I'd tasted in months. It was hot and strong and real. As I sat there in that worn-out vinyl booth, I realized something. I hadn't engineered a downfall. I hadn't plotted a revenge. All I had done was present a single, undeniable truth. The rest wasn't my doing. The rest was just gravity. The first reports of the wreckage started coming in a few days later. My neighbor, who loved a bit of gossip, called to tell me she'd seen a big tow truck outside Leo and Chloe's trendy downtown apartment building, hauling away a shiny black Porsche. She said Chloe had been standing on the curb, screaming into her phone. That was the first visible crack in their perfect, curated world. Out of a strange, detached curiosity, I logged onto my old desktop computer and found Chloe's Instagram page. Her usual feed of glamorous work trips and expensive dinners was gone. In its place was a single, new video. It was her, sitting in a dimly lit room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She was attempting an apology. She used a lot of their favorite words: misalignment, inauthenticity, losing our narrative, but she never once used the word stole. She said they had been moving too fast, that they had made mistakes in their passion to innovate. But the internet is not a forgiving place. The comment section was a digital tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage, thief, fraud, parasite. My parents invested with you. I hope you rot. I watched for a few minutes, the endless scrolling wall of hatred, and then I closed the window. It felt like watching a building burn down. You can't look away, but there's no joy in it. A week after that, they made the local evening news. There was a reporter standing in front of their sleek office building, talking gravely about a promising local startup under investigation by the Attorney General for multiple counts of investor fraud. Their corporate headshots flashed on the screen, Leo looking so young and confident, Chloe with that same triumphant smirk she'd had in the lawyer's office. They looked like ghosts from a different lifetime. While their world was imploding, mine was quietly starting to bloom again. I started volunteering at the community garden down the street. I found a deep, simple satisfaction in it. My hands, which had spent years on keyboards and calculator buttons, were now in the dirt, tending to tomato plants and rows of lettuce. The work was honest and real. You couldn't fake a harvest. You couldn't write a press release to convince a seed to grow. It either did or it didn't. My house started to feel like my own again. The silence was no longer empty. It was peaceful. I put the dust cover back on my Monroe adding machine and placed my green ledger in the bottom drawer of my desk. Their job was done. Order had been restored. I didn't know what had happened to Leo until about a month later. I was driving near the airport, on my way to the big Costco out on the highway, and I saw it. A fulfillment center. A truly massive, windowless, beige building the size of a small town, with a familiar, smiling logo on the side. And standing near one of the loading bays, wearing a bright yellow safety vest and holding a scanner gun, was my son. He didn't see me. He was just a small figure in a vast, industrial landscape, his shoulders slumped, his movements mechanical. He would scan a box, place it on a conveyor belt, and wait for the next one. Scan. Place. Wait. He had spent his whole life trying to escape my world of manifests and shipping schedules, a world he thought was small and beneath him. And he had ended up here, in a much bigger, much less forgiving version of it. He wasn't a visionary CEO with a corner office. He was a number, an employee with a quota to meet by the end of his shift. He was, in the end, just another package in the system. I didn't stop the car. I didn't get out. I just kept driving, my hands steady on the wheel. I had thought that seeing him brought so low would feel like a victory, but it didn't. It just felt like a tragedy. It was a waste. All that brightness, all that ambition twisted into something ugly and false, and now, finally, reduced to this. That afternoon, I worked in my garden until the sun went down. The air was cool, and the soil was rich and dark in my hands. I picked a ripe, red tomato from the vine. It was heavy and real. It was something I had created with my own 2 hands, with patience and honest work. My lawyers were slowly recovering my money. They called it clawing back the assets. But holding that tomato, feeling its solid, earthy weight, I realized I already had everything of value back. They had been chasing a fantasy on a screen. The whole time, the real treasure was right here, in the dirt, waiting for anyone willing to do the work. And in the months that followed, the work was all I had. The lawyers handled the legal wreckage, sending me updates in thick manila envelopes that I would read and file away. My money was slowly, painstakingly being recovered, but my heart had moved on from it. My new currency was sunlight and water. My new balance sheet was the number of ripe tomatoes on the vine. The community garden became my sanctuary. It was a place of quiet, steady growth, a place where things made sense. I was on my knees, pulling weeds from around the base of a zucchini plant, when a shadow fell over me. I didn't look up at first, assuming it was one of the other gardeners, but the shadow just stood there, silent. I finally shielded my eyes from the late afternoon sun and looked up. It was Leo. I hadn't seen him since I'd spotted him at the fulfillment center. He was thinner now, and the trendy, expensive clothes were gone, replaced by worn jeans and a faded gray t-shirt. His face had lost its boyish softness, and his hands, which he kept nervously by his sides, were no longer the smooth hands of a man who worked on a keyboard. They were the hands of a man who worked. The arrogance that had radiated from him like a heat wave was gone, replaced by a deep, settled weariness. He didn't step into my garden plot. He just stood on the narrow dirt path, waiting. I finished pulling the weed, shook the dirt from its roots, and tossed it into my bucket. I took my time, my movements slow and deliberate. Finally, I pushed myself up, my knees cracking a little, and brushed the soil from my hands onto my pants. I just looked at him. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't make excuses. He just swallowed hard and held out a folded piece of paper. It was trembling slightly in his hand. I hesitated for a moment, then took it from him. The paper wasn't a glossy printout from a fancy laptop. It was a standard piece of copy paper, soft and a little wrinkled, the kind you find in any office supply room. I unfolded it. It was a flowchart, hand-drawn with a blue ballpoint pen. It was a detailed, complex diagram of the pick-and-pack line at the fulfillment center. I saw boxes for initial scan, conveyor route A, manual sort, final weigh-in. Arrows and dotted lines showed the path of a package through the system. And then, in red ink, there was a second set of arrows, showing a different path, a detour that bypassed a redundant checkpoint and streamlined the flow to the final loading bay. At the bottom, in small, neat block letters, he had written, "Proposed workflow modification, estimated time savings, 12 seconds per unit." I stared at the drawing. It was a logistical analysis, a damn good one. It was the kind of elegant, practical, money-saving solution I used to design in my sleep. It was a language I understood better than any other. He finally spoke, his voice quiet and a little raspy, as if he hadn't used it much that day. "It's the bottleneck," he said, pointing a finger at a spot on the diagram. At the final scan, they were creating a backlog because the packages weren't properly sorted upstream. It was inefficient. He looked up from the paper and met my eyes. For the first time, I think, in a very long time, he was really seeing me, and I was really seeing him. "I get it now, Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "You don't just see the packages, you see the whole system." I looked down at the flowchart in my hands. This piece of paper, this simple, honest piece of work, was the apology he could never have put into words. He wasn't asking for my forgiveness. He was showing me he was finally ready to forgive himself. He was showing me he had learned how to work. He had learned that value wasn't something you declared in a press release. It was something you built, quietly and carefully, 1 second saved at a time. I folded the paper carefully along its original creases and looked at my son. the tired, humbled man who stood before me. "It's a good system, Leo," I said softly. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching a great weight being lifted from his shoulders. He gave me a small, hesitant nod, a gesture of shared understanding that was more intimate than any hug we'd had in years. He didn't ask for more. He didn't ask to come over for dinner. He just stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked away down the dirt path, his back straight, his footsteps steady. I stayed there in my garden, holding the flowchart until the sun dipped below the horizon. I finally put the folded paper into the pocket of my jeans. It felt more valuable than any check my lawyers could ever recover. My son had tried to build his future on a foundation of lies and illusion, and it had all crumbled to dust. But here, in my garden, he had brought me a single, truthful thing he had built with his own 2 hands. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't a tech empire. But it was a start, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like hope. In the end, this was never a story about money. The money was just the language they used, the currency of their ambition. I had spent my life working with a different kind of currency: reliability, integrity, the simple, quiet value of a promise kept. They had tried to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, dazzled by the view from the top, never bothering to check the bedrock. They believed in disruption, in moving fast and breaking things. And they had broken the most important thing of all, the trust that had been my life's work to build. My world, the one they saw as small and old-fashioned, was built on something else. It was built on the solid ground of things that were real, the patience of a seed, the undeniable truth of a balanced ledger. The quiet strength of a foundation that had been laid, brick by brick, over a lifetime of doing the right thing, especially when no one was watching. My competence, the skill set they had dismissed as a relic from a forgotten time, turned out to be the one thing their flashy, modern world had no defense against. They saw a quiet, retired woman. They failed to see the manager who could track a single shipment across a continent in a blizzard. They saw a folksy investor. They failed to see the auditor who knew, in her bones, when the numbers didn't add up. Their greatest mistake was underestimating the power of the world they came from, and the woman who had built it for them. What I did wasn't revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy, emotional fire. What I did was an audit. It was cold and quiet and precise. It was about one thing and one thing only: accountability. I didn't set out to destroy my son. I set out to force him to face the balance sheet of his own life. His real redemption didn't come from me forgiving him. It came, finally, from himself, in the form of a hand-drawn chart, a quiet admission that the systems of the real world, the ones built on work and discipline, were the only ones that truly mattered. He had to lose his entire imagined future to finally find his footing in the real world. We all have a ledger for our lives, a balance sheet where the currency isn't dollars, but choices, actions, and the integrity with which we live. Every day we make deposits or withdrawals. Every promise we keep, every shortcut we refuse to take, adds to our real worth. Every time we choose the easy lie over the hard truth, we diminish our own account. So let me ask you, when the final accounting is done and that last page is turned, what will your life's work truly be worth? If this story of finding strength in the quiet truth resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. And don't forget to give this video a like if you believe in the power of quiet competence. And be sure to subscribe for more stories about real-world strength and the courage it takes to balance the books. Thank you so much for your time and for your incredible support. We'll see you in the next story.